welcome here to this session about the new SPA single page application editor 2.0 and how you can basically in context edit your own single page application without having to refactor everything. My name is Gabriel Wolt and I'm a product manager for AM Sites, and I'm presenting this with Sharanya. So maybe also give a quick word about yourself.
Hi, so I'm a developer working on the feature in the AM Sites editor team.
Thank you. We'll also be joined by Patrick for mostly helping out on the Q&A side. He's still held back on a previous session, but he'll join us as soon as we get started here so that he can take some of those as well. He's basically the engineering manager for that feature also. So yeah, the agenda maybe quickly first. We will have an overview of your options that you have now if you want to edit your single page application with AM. We'll then see at the timeline how these different possibilities are laid out in the time, because some of the features that we'll show here are still being worked on. We'll have a great demo by Sharanya, and we'll end up with some technical summary about the technical steps that she will have demoed as well. So first, maybe quickly, if you have like a single page application, we have here just a wireframe of what could be a single page application very basically. And you want to insert some content here from AM. Obviously, the simplest way to go forward is to use GraphQL. And you are maybe coming from the previous session where we have told you how to do that. And GraphQL really is a great format for really low entry barrier to consume content from AM. With that API, you can basically formulate your query. You can pick in the query the variables that you need in your application, and then you can consume them and display them in the UI of your application. There is really a lot of benefits here for developers because they can consume a very flexible JSON API. They have basically the full control over the single page application, how it's built. There is no specific dependency to AM in any form at that point. And the single page application can also easily live anywhere outside of AM. For authors, however, it's a little bit more limited. They are basically limited to the form-based editing, and they don't have any layout or preview ability. They must just enter the raw content and maybe go to a different URL to check how the application will render those. What we have with a single page application is kind of a very opposite approach here. So the single application editor, as it was so far, is that on your app, you insert a container, and inside of this container, most of the items that are rendered are actually really driven from AM as components. You must map the components that you have in AM to the components that you have in React so that React knows how to render what you are moving around in AM. And this is really powerful for the authors here. For the developers, however, here it's a little bit more complicated. Luckily, there is a good SDK with all the components also now available in React and Angular, so you don't need to rebuild the most obvious components that you might want to use maybe with the core components. You, however, have a very limited control over the layout and the states of the application, basically what it displays as content. So the layout is roughly limited either outside of that container. So if there is a header and a footer that you are controlling statically and that the author cannot really interact with, this is in the control of the developer then. And what is rendered inside of each component is also controlled by the developers. But how things are arranged and moved around is controlled by the author here. And that might sometimes cause a little bit challenging in application where these components maybe heavily interact with each other. Also, one downside is that the single page application must be hosted inside of AM. At least so far, it really wasn't easily possible to have it outside of AM. There is always a way to get this possible, but it's additional work. For the authors, they, however, have a great control. They can preview and in-context edit the single page application. And they can also drive the states, as I said, of the application through the content structure, so that when they create a new page, it will create also a new state or a new view, you could maybe also call it, in the single page application. But the problem here is that it's quite a radical approach that we have. And it requires to build your single page application very tightly with AEM in mind. If you have a previous single page app, it will be probably hard to convert everything to work that way. So this is why we're now working on this single page application 2.0 that should ease that very much. The idea here is that the developer can define some placeholders or areas where the authors are allowed to drop some content. And this, at that point, is basically author land. The authors control this area. They control how things are displayed inside there. But everything around, in between these components and so on, is still very much controlled by the developer. And so they have basically the full control over their app. They don't need to give off too much of their control here. The single page application can still live outside of AEM, be hosted elsewhere if desired. And the components are that basically for these placeholders where you want the authors to drop their stuff into, are also available in the SDK, like in the first version of the SPA editor. But basically the big difference here is that the developers need to define where in the markup and in which places of the app these containers or these placeholders are displayed for the authors. So these the developer defines where the editable sections will be. The authors then can really have the full control with these areas, but the content structure is actually driven from the application and not from the page content structure. We'll see that also maybe a little bit in the demo, but the idea is really that you don't let the app being dictated too much by the content structure, and it's more the other way around, that the content structure is dictated from the application. So if a developer adds a container at some place and says that this container content should come from, and he will indicate a path on a page, then this page must exist. And the author maybe can, if it doesn't exist yet, create that page, but that's very much following the application's structure then. Here, I would like to come to the timeline, because what I've told you with this single page application 2.0 is a little bit an preview of what we are going to do for the second half of this year. For now, what is available to you already, and that has been actually already available since the end of last year, is in-between state, but that allows you to do very much of that already, which is why we're talking about that here. We have basically two concepts that are usable so far, and that really brings you a long way already along the path to the SPA Editor 2.0. The first one is a remote page component, and the second is the concept of these editable sections that the developers can define in their application. So with a remote page component, you basically can load an application, a web application that is outside of AEM, hosted elsewhere, into the page editor. It is, however, not the final solution. So there are some limitations there, because what we actually do is that we rely on the manifest.json file to exist and to properly indicate which files should be loaded for the application to work. And this remote page component will actually load these scripts from the manifest.json and initialize them on the page that is in the page editor. So it's kind of loading the page through this convention of the manifest.json file. What will not work with this kind of intermediate solution is that if the single page application relies on specific markup or on specific meta tags or script tags that load further things that maybe are not defined in the manifest.json, then you would need to actually customize that remote page component and insert that markup yourself on a project level. The final SPA Editor 2.0, however, will really allow to also load the HTML of the page that will be on a remote URL, and to really seamlessly allow to edit remote application that way. With that, I will hand it over to Sharanya for the demo.
Thank you, Gabriel. So I'll be doing a quick walkthrough of the different steps and configurations that are needed to add sections in your SPA that will be editable on AAM. So we will just first take a look at the AAM side of things and see what needs to be done there to enable remote app editing. Assume you have an AAM instance up and running. Here you would need to deploy a sample or reference site like Weekend SPA or create a new one from scratch using the AAM project archetype. Once you have a project up and running, so for example, I have a sample site called Weekend SPA here, you can update your page component to use the newly released remote page component. This is part of an open source repository, AAM SPA project core. And once you're using this component, you can go to the page properties. Here you see that we have a new tab for SPA. Yes, so we need to enter your SPA's host URL in this field. So for this demo, I'm using a simple React app that is hosted on a GitHub page. So I can just copy this host URL and use it here. So this will take care of fetching the asset manifest and loading the necessary scripts and style sheets and loading the application within the editor. So as you can see, the app is now visible inside of AAM. Now let's move on to the SPA side of things and take a look at what is the configuration needed over there to add editable sections. Here, the first and foremost, you need to include AAM SPA SDK. So these are three NPM packages, all of which are open sourced. We have SPA component mapping, SPA page model manager, and React editable components. Just to give you a quick overview, overall, these packages help AAM editor to understand the data that is being exposed by your application. And it does this with the help of the page model, which is essentially a JSON that is containing the structure of all the data that your application has stored within the AAM repository. If you would like to know more about each of these packages and what they do, please take a look at the public documentation. So once you have these dependencies installed within your project, next you would need to instantiate the model client. So this is a class that is being provided by the page model manager, which handles fetching the page model from AAM. Now, since your app and AAM is no longer in the same location, you need to explicitly let the model client know that it needs to look for the model elsewhere. So you instantiate or create a custom model client and pass the AAM instance's host URL to the constructor. Once you have this available, we can move on to the next step, which is initialization of the model manager, which is a very crucial step since it handles not only initialization of model manager, but also initialization of all other internal classes, as well as creation of the model store. So as you can see, you can provide options to the initialization, but in the case of a remote app editor, the only mandatory one is the model client, which we just discussed. Previously, we used to do this initialization synchronously, which meant that you had to wait for all the processes to be completed and the model to be fetched before the application to be rendered. But now, since your SPA is no longer rendering only AEM content, we've introduced it for asynchronous initialization, which is what I've used here. Another thing to keep in mind is that this initialization needs to be done absolutely before your application is being rendered. So in terms of React, this means that you need to do this before React DOM.render, and that should do the configuration. So now we can move on to actually adding editable sections. Before we do that, let's go back to the project and take a quick look at its content structure in Crxd. So I have a home page which already has some content. That is, it has a layout container with a text in it with hello world. So what we'll be trying to do is we'll try to add this entire home page's content inside our SPA. So for this, first, we need to create a page component. I'm just reusing the one already provided by React Editable Components. Now, to make this page editable in AM, we've introduced a new helper called WithMappable. So this will take care of fetching the model from whichever location you specify, as well as adding all the attributes and wrappers that are essential to make the component editable on AM side. Once you've included this as well, the component is done and ready to be included within your application. So I want to add this page content at the very bottom of my home page. That is to say below the adventures component. So I import the AM page that I've just created, and I use a new prop called page path, which is essentially how we tell the component where the model needs to be fetched from. So since I need to render the home page content, I provide the path that is content weekend SPA home, since this is a page that is directly under the project. Once the path to the page has been provided, this is done, and it should now be available within your page on AEM and inside the application. So let's go back to Crxd just to reiterate. So this is the page path for the corresponding page that we would like to display in the app. If I refresh this, I should see hello world here. Now let's go to the editor and see how it looks at the editor side. So you can see that there is a text node here with a layout container as well visible. We can try to edit this. And maybe let's try to add a new text content as well. And save it. Now, when we go back to our SPA and refresh it, you can see the updated content is now available here as well. So the same way as we've done page, if you want to explicitly pick one particular node and display just that, that is possible as well. You just need to provide an additional prop called item path, which is the path to the item within that particular page. And from the component perspective, it's not really that different. You just need to take care of a few additional things. First one being that within the config, you need to provide the resource type on the AEM side. And in WithMappable, you need to provide the config as an additional parameter. And with that, we're done with the quick walkthrough. Thanks, and over to you, Patrick.
Okay, so you got the demo. Let's now quickly recap. So there is two sides. There is the backend project configuration, there is the front-end project configuration. So let's start speaking about the backend project configuration. So first, there is the backend configuration. So you have to generate your app. You can use the archetype or the project, SPA project core. So that's one. And then you deploy this project to AEM. This will constitute the backend logic, Sling models, services, all these, the dialogues and the components that are enabling the authoring experience. Then you're going to modify the resource or the super resource type of the page to point to the remote page component, as you can see in the picture below. Next, you will have to configure the front-end project. So Gabriel, can you navigate? Yes, perfect. Where you will have to list these three dependencies in your project, instantiate the model client, and set the URL that points to your AEM instance, so that the model manager can then fetch the model and display the data and have the front-end component render this data. And finally, before your app starts, we require you to initialize the page model manager. Then to create an editable section, you will be required to provide a resource type from which the mapping can be done between the front-end logic or the front-end presentation logic and the back-end logic first. And we will also require you to use this with mappable that we are providing. And basically that is enabling the authoring capability. When you are instantiating the components, we require you to set these two properties, the page path, which is basically the location in the database where the data will be stored, and the item path, which is the more precisely the location of your item, of your instance of components. So you have this composition of the page and the item path that will precisely give you the location where the data are stored. You have the links to where you can read more of these concepts. You can also access to all the resources that will allow you to start right away in Cloud Service and AM 6.5 to use the remote page app component to inject script from a React app into AM and start authoring.
So maybe just to summarize, there have been a lot of questions also on server-side renderings, and server-side rendering doesn't really change between SPA Editor 1.0 and SPA Editor 2.0. It's very much the same. And it is done actually via the Adobe I/O runtime, which is Node.js runtime. So this is basically very much familiar territory for the front-end developer, and the runtime basically simulates like a browser would the rendering and returns that to AM, which can then integrate it into the response so that the response from AM has everything you would like to be rendered in there.
Question for you, Gabriel. Is there any support for Vue.js in the roadmaps?
We don't have that on the roadmap for now yet. It is a challenge for us to support always the new upcoming frameworks. For now, React seems very much to be the leading one. Vue is indeed catching up, but there are also new ones that are coming up quickly. So the question and the challenge always is, the more frameworks we support, the more we dilute our efforts. And it's about finding the right balance. It is possible, however, for you to implement Vue yourself. And we have customers who have done it. Because what you see typically here on the list of single page application editor SDKs is that actually there is just one of them that is really React specific, and the others are agnostic of the framework. So what you need to re-implement for Vue, if you would like to support, is basically the Vue counterpart of the React editable components. That is basically just the concept of a container, of a page, and the parses. That's basically the kind of basic concepts that are in there. However, we are also providing React core components. So there are several core components that are implemented in React, and you would need to re-implement them as well for Vue. So that would be basically the work for those who do want to use Vue or any other framework that we don't yet support. And you could start an open source initiative there. Maybe others, I'm sure that others would also love to benefit. It's mostly a question of if you have the possibility to do that.
For you, Shania, does the doc elaborate on usage of hooks, complex state management, and dynamic routes, etc.? Is there anything that you would like to say regarding to hooks and complex state management?
I don't
specific.
I don't think we have a documentation yet, but it works as expected with hooks as well. So in this application as well, we tried initially with hooks to fetch the data and update the models, update the paths. So it doesn't really affect it. It's not really a hindrance. But when we, or if and when we release the documentation, we can add some pointers on this as well.
So we are also being, Gabriel, you are being asked or suggested to publish a sample server-side rendering as well to have a great reference.
Yeah, I agree. That would make sense. I'm scrambling with the links. I'm getting there. Pasting you the links into the chat pod.
Okay. I guess that this question will be multiplying the complexity that we were talking about earlier, but we are asked if we intend to later support increasingly popular meta frameworks like Jamstack, Gatsby, and Next.js.
Yeah, we'll see how we get there. I mean, first thing first, we already need to see how that works with React here, and to really get you on a state that is easy with that. If we are then having a state where we have you getting started with React really quickly and easily, then we can start to look into maybe other frameworks, other meta frameworks and things like that. Yeah. By the way, time's mostly up. I mean, we can stay around a little bit now for further Q&A because there is a networking break now for you. But feel free to move to that if you wish.
Shall we continue answering question live?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
The next, entering, yes.
So the next question would be, is there an estimate date for the SP editor? Gary, do you want to answer that question? I can maybe help you answer it instead.
The SP editor 2.0?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can go ahead for that.
Okay, so it's still in development. So we have the first great sign. So you can right away use the remote page component as is. That's already a solution for authoring a SPA that is on a different domain. Let's say the SPA 2.0 per se will come later this year, most probably. H2 2021, ideally. And which AM version support SPA 2.0? So we've answered this question earlier as well. So for the remote page app, you're going to be able to use it with Cloud Service and 6.5 right away. And for the SPA 2.0, you will be able to use it on Cloud Service only for now, mostly because of the breaking changes, and the challenge it would be to backport breaking changes. So next question, is the SPA editor being adapted by AM customers? How popular is this tool? Gabriel, do you want to jump in?
Can you repeat?
Is the SPA editor being adapted by AM customers, or how popular is this tool?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of customers who use it, but the use case so far has been mostly for content-centric single-page apps. So if you have a content-centric app and you're building it new from scratch with AM in mind, then it's the perfect story for a single-page application editor. But this is basically why we're now improving this and making the improvements that we presented you, because there are a lot of situations where the application is not primarily content-driven and where you have already an existing single-page application. For these two use cases, which are basically the vast majority, I think, the improvements that we're introducing now will be very helpful and probably open to many, many more customers using that in the future.
Okay, so I'm just ask for some more words on the question. Other than that, I guess we are getting closer to the end of the session.
Yeah, so John is asking a question about elaborating on Firefly in relation to AM. So, I mean, typically here, if you want to have server-side rendering, it's AM that dedicates that to Firefly. So Firefly is, or the IO runtime, it's the same thing, right? So it would be nice, basically, to have that integrated well into AM, packaged together, and so that it would work out of the box immediately. You don't need to set up much more. That would be the idea going forward. And there are other use cases also for Firefly that would be helpful to extend AEM and to provide good additions for many other things that are JavaScript related and front-end related as well. So I think for all these use cases, that will be probably happening. I cannot talk much more about that as it's being discussed right now. But yeah, that's a possible future move indeed.
So I'll try to answer the question of Paul in the meantime. So is it possible for Angular React framework not as a single page application within AEM? I'm going to try to interpret here. You can always use web components to add SPA frameworks and logic within a web component and HTML. That's something that customers are already doing.
Thank you for having joined this. I hope it was useful for you. See you around. We'll have also later after this networking break, the Adobe Client Data Layer session. And after that, we'll also have the session about the future front-end development workflow. So see you around. Have a great time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.